A man named Thomas Tie Hack Johnson cut 40 railroad ties a day with a broadaxe in the Medicine Bow Mountains of Wyoming. 40 ties, from standing timber to finished 8-foot ties, each one squared by hand to within a quarter inch. When the Union Pacific reached Cheyenne, it had consumed 3,000 ties per mile, 1.5 million ties for the first 500 miles alone, every single one cut by a man like Johnson, and nobody ever wrote down his full name. I've been through the Union Pacific payroll books from 1867 and 1868. They are stained with pine pitch and mouse droppings and the coffee rings of clerks who are long dead. Johnson shows up twice. Once as T. Johnson, Tie Hack, Rock Creek Camp. Once as Tie Hack Johnson, paid in full, $37.50. No first name, no middle initial, no next of kin. And the man cut wood that ran under the wheels of American history, and the company that paid him didn't bother to learn what his mother called him. If you care about the forgotten men who built this country with their hands, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. One click. That's the whole ask. This channel is about the work that isn't in the textbooks, the names the paychecks didn't keep. Stick with me, because the story of the American railroad tie is stranger and harder and more beautiful than you have been told. Here's what I want you to picture. 1867. The Union Pacific is climbing out of the Platte Valley toward the Continental Divide. Every single mile of track needs 3,000 cross ties. Each tie is 8 feet long, 7 inches thick, 8 inches wide on the face, squared on 2 sides so the rails sit flat. Squared within a quarter-inch tolerance, or the company inspector rejects it and you don't get paid for that tie. You cut it and you carried it and you stacked it and you get nothing. Now, multiply. 3,000 ties per mile times 1,776 miles from Omaha to Sacramento. That's 5.3 million ties for the first transcontinental alone. And the transcontinental was one line. By 1900, America had 193,000 miles of railroad track. Do the arithmetic. You get numbers that stop making sense. Somewhere north of 600 million ties cut by hand in the second half of the 19th century. Every one of them squared by a man with a broadaxe standing over a fallen tree in a place with no road. And that's the question that kept me up the first night I started reading about this. Where did all that wood come from? Who cut it? How did they live? Because 600 million ties doesn't appear out of nowhere. 600 million ties means an army. And that army has almost no monument. The answer, when I found it, came out of Wyoming, out of the Medicine Bow Mountains, where the lodgepole pine grows straight and tight-grained and right for a tie, and where in the winter the temperature sits at 20 below zero for weeks at a stretch. The men who cut there were called tie hacks, and most of them had names that ended in son and sen, because most of them had come off a boat in New York with a crate of tools and a Swedish Bible, and a letter of introduction to a foreman who spoke Norwegian. Thomas Johnson was one of them. I can tell you that much. He came into the Medicine Bow country sometime before the Union Pacific reached Rock Creek in 1868. The payroll has him listed as Swede in one column, Norwegian in another, so either the clerks didn't know or didn't care to tell one from the other. He was 26. He stood 6'1". A foreman in a later document described him as quiet man, strong back, honest with the broadaxe. That was the whole obituary. Strong back, honest with the broadaxe. He got his nickname, the First Winner. The story in the camp was that a new cookhouse boy asked which Johnson was Johnson, because the camp had 5 of them. Somebody said, the Tie Hack Johnson, and it stuck. He answered to it until he died. He did die in those mountains. I'll get to that. 40 ties a day. Let's break that apart. Because until you understand what went into one tie, you can't understand what it meant to cut 40. You walk out to your cut at daylight. You carry a crosscut saw, a single-bit felling axe, a broadaxe that weighs 9 pounds, a set of iron wedges, a sledge, and a whetstone in your pocket. You find your tree, lodgepole pine, 12 to 14 inches at the butt, tall and straight because lodgepole grows that way when it grows in thickets. You score a notch on the fall side with the felling axe. You drop to your knees, and you pull the crosscut through the backside of the trunk. The tree goes. You limb it, You bucket to 8-foot lengths with the crosscut. Then comes the hacking. This is where the name tie hack comes from. You take the broad axe, which has one flat side and one beveled side, and you score the log with short vertical chops every 6 inches along the length. Scoring. Then you flip the broadaxe and you hew. You stand alongside the log and you swing the broadaxe parallel to the grain, slicing off the scored sections in long flat chips. You're taking a round log and making it square on 2 sides, working only with the weight of the axe and the angle of your wrists. A good tie hack could hew a face in about 4 minutes. Flip the log, hew the other face in another 4. Inspect with a straight stick laid across the face. If it's flat within a 1/4 inch, you set it aside. If it's not, you hew again until it is, or you split it for firewood. Your pay depends on tolerance. The Union Pacific paid 10 to 15 cents per accepted tie in 1868. By 1900, a good hack made 25 cents a tie. If Johnson cut 40 a day, he made $10 in one winter day, which was extraordinary money. It also meant he never stopped moving from dawn to dark. Before I tell you what happened to Johnson, and before I tell you how they got those ties out of the mountains, I need you to do me one favor. Hit the subscribe button. I mean it. This channel only survives if the algorithm sees that people want old industry stories. One click, then come back, because what comes next is the piece nobody teaches. The Medicine Bow tie camps ran from October to April. That was on purpose. You cut in the cold because the sap was down, which meant the wood was lighter and cured better. You cut in the cold because the snow gave you a surface to skid the finished ties. You cut in the cold because the ice on the Laramie River and the North Platte would break up in April and take a winter's work to the sidings at Fort Steele and Rock Creek and Medicine Bow Town. The camps were simple: a log bunkhouse with a stove at each end, a cookhouse with a Norwegian or Swedish cook because the men wanted coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon, a stable for the draft horses, a blacksmith shed. That was it. 50 men, 100 in the big camps. The bunks were double-tiered, built against the wall, filled with pine boughs under a wool blanket. You slept in your long johns because nothing ever truly dried. The cookhouse was the heart of the camp. The cook was up at 2 in the morning to start the stove. By 5, he had biscuits, salt pork, beans, stewed dried apples, and coffee on the long plank tables. The men came in by lantern light, wordless, still in their wool coats. They ate in silence. Talking at breakfast was considered bad luck in a tie camp, same as it was in the West Coast logging camps. A man who spoke at the morning table got a look from the pusher that lasted him all week. Noon dinner came to the cut in a tin bucket: beans, bacon, and bread. 10 minutes to eat. You ate sitting on the log you were hewing. You stood up and you went back to it. At dark, you walked home to the bunkhouse, sometimes 2 miles, and the cook had a supper of stew on the stove and a kettle of coffee that had been boiling since morning and was strong enough to stand a spoon. You ate. You smoked if you smoked. You slept. Saturday night in camp was the one concession to being alive. A fiddle came out. Somebody had a harmonica. The Norwegians sang Norwegian. The Swedes sang Swedish. The one Welshman in the encampment camp sang hymns in Welsh that nobody understood, but everyone stopped to listen to. Mail came when the supply sled came, which was once every 2 weeks if the weather held. Men wrote letters home in pencil, in careful handwriting, on paper they had carried folded in their coat pockets for the purpose. I'm going to tell you about 2 more men. Their names came out of the ledgers at Fort Steele and out of a cemetery in Saratoga, Wyoming, that I walked through with a notebook and a dead phone battery one October. The first was Per Olsen. He came to New York in 1884 from a fishing village outside Trondheim. He worked the Great Lakes lumber camps for 4 seasons and then heard there was better money in the Wyoming tie camps. He came west on a Union Pacific emigrant car in the fall of 1888. He was 31. He had a wife in Norway named Ingrid and a daughter named Marit who was 4 years old. He had never seen them since the week before he sailed. He sent money home every month through a bank in Chicago. Per Olsen cut ties for 12 winters in the Medicine Bow. He was known in camp for 2 things. He could hew a face in 3 minutes flat, and he kept a leather-bound Bible under his pillow in Norwegian and read a chapter every night by the oil lamp before he slept. In 1900, he finally had enough saved to send for Ingrid and Marit. The tickets were bought, the letter was written. The letter is in an archive in Cheyenne. It never got mailed. In February of 1900, Per Olsen was hewing a face on a lodgepole in a stand-up above Elk Mountain when the tree he had felled shifted in the snow and rolled onto him. His partner, a man named Gustafson, heard him call out once. By the time Gustafson got to him, Per Olsen was dead. The tie he had been hewing was one face complete. The second face was never cut. The camp paid to ship his body down to Saratoga. His stone reads, Per Olsen, Norge, tie hack, no dates. The foreman sent $112 and the leather Bible to Ingrid in Trondheim. She never came. Marit, the daughter, grew up and moved to Minnesota in 1908 with her mother. I haven't found what happened after that. That was one man. Because here is the thing about the tie camps that doesn't make the Wyoming tourism brochures. Men died in those camps at a rate that would shut down a modern industry in a week. Trees rolled on them. Axes glanced off frozen wood and took a kneecap. Frostbite took fingers and then hands. Pneumonia took the men who went to their bunks with a cough and didn't wake up. The tie drives on the rivers in April drowned men every single season. I have a list from one company's ledger at Fort Steele, 1888 to 1910. The company employed an average of 400 tie hacks per winter. Over those 22 years, the ledger records 247 deaths, more than one in every 35 men, every single winter. The second man I want you to know was named Anders Lindqvist. He came from Värmland in central Sweden in 1895. He was 22. He had been a forester for a Swedish timber company at home, and he knew lodgepole because lodgepole grows in Värmland too. He took the train to Laramie. He walked the last 40 miles into the Medicine Bow Camp, carrying his broadaxe and his bedroll, and a wooden box with his mother's photograph and a wedge of hard cheese wrapped in wax paper. Lindqvist was a favorite in camp. He could sing. He had a baritone voice that carried out across the snow when he worked. And the old hacks said they could tell which cut was his from a quarter mile away because you could hear the hymn through the trees. He cut ties for 8 winters. He sent home enough money to buy his mother a small house. He wrote his sister in Gothenburg long letters about the mountains, the color of the light on the snow in the morning, the way the stars at 8,000 feet seemed to be so close you could touch them. 2 of those letters survive in a Swedish-American museum in Minneapolis. I've read them. The handwriting is careful. The English is broken, but the Swedish is clean as a psalm. In March of 1903, Anders Lindqvist rode the Spring Tie Drive down the North Platte. The drive was the way the ties got to the railroad. All winter, the hacks cut and stacked. In the thaw, teams of horses skidded the ties to the riverbank. When the ice broke, the camp dumped every tie into the river at once, 200,000-300,000 ties at a time, floating down to the splash booms at the railhead. The drivers walked on the ties with pike poles and caulked boots, breaking jams, pushing strays off sandbars. It was every bit as dangerous as the river work in Wisconsin and Maine that killed a man a week. Lindqvist went into the water on the second day of the drive, 3 miles below Saratoga. Nobody saw the jam shift. The body came up at Fort Steele 6 days later. The camp bought him a pine coffin, and the baritone voice that had carried across the snow was buried in the little Lutheran plot at Saratoga under a stone that reads A. Lindqvist, Värmland, tie hack, 1903. His sister in Gothenburg received the wooden box with his mother's photograph and a final pay envelope of $43. I want to tell you about one more before I move on, because I promised 3, and because this one makes me think about what kind of country this was. Johan Berg came out of Småland in 1878. By 1898, he was the pusher at a tie camp on the Encampment River. A pusher was the foreman. Berg was 47. He had cut ties for 20 winters, and he could still hew a face in 3.5 minutes, and he didn't ask any man under him to do what he wouldn't do himself. The camp had 60 men that winter. 52 of them were Scandinavian, 4 were Finns, 1 was a black man out of Missouri named Washington, who had come west on the railroad in 1880 and stayed. 1 was a Welshman. 1 was a kid from Iowa who had read a dime novel about the frontier and turned up at the camp in thin boots and a store-bought coat. Berg took the kid under his wing, taught him to score and hew without taking a finger off, lent him a pair of his own wool mittens when the kid's cotton gloves froze to his hands in the first week. The kid's name was Charlie Pickett. He was 19. He learned. He made it through the winter. He went home to Iowa in May. The letter he wrote Berg the following fall is in a box at the Wyoming State Archive. Dear Mr. Berg, I write to thank you. I cut ties because you showed me how. I did not die because you showed me how. I've gone back to school. My mother is well. Yours truly, Charlie. Johann Berg didn't go home. He died in 1911 of black lung and frostbite complications in a boarding house in Saratoga. He was 60. His stone is a flat sandstone slab the size of a book. It reads only Berg Pusher. I promised you I would tell you about Thomas Johnson. Johnson stayed in the Medicine Bow for 40 years. I have him in the 1870 census at Rock Creek, the 1880 census at Fort Steele, the 1900 census at Carbon. The occupation column on every one of them reads tie hacker. He never married. He never bought land. He sent a portion of his pay to a woman in Chicago named Anna from 1875 until she died in 1897. I don't know who Anna was. I suspect a sister. The payroll clerks noted her name in a margin once, and that's the only trace. In the winter of 1908, Johnson was 67 years old and still cutting. The younger hacks, the second generation, the sons of men like Olson and Lindquist, watched him work and shook their heads. A man of 67 in a tie camp was a ghost. He still made his numbers. He worked out of the Bridger Pass camp that winter. On a Tuesday in February, a blizzard closed down the cut and the men came into the bunkhouse. Johnson didn't come. They found him the next morning. He had sat down against the base of a lodgepole to rest. His broadaxe was across his knees. The snow had drifted over him to his chest. The book in his coat pocket was a Norwegian New Testament. He was frozen solid. They buried Thomas Johnson in the Carbon Cemetery. The stone says, Tie Hack Johnson. Below that, Medicine Bow. Below that, 1908. No first name. No first name anywhere, in any record I have found, after 40 years of cutting wood for the nation. That is the grief that sits underneath all of this. Men gave their whole lives to the wood that runs under the rail, and the company didn't keep their names, and the nation doesn't know the work was done. Here is the scale once more, because I want it to sit with you. 3,000 ties per mile. 193,000 miles of American track by 1900. The Medicine Bow camps alone produced 10 million ties for the Union Pacific between 1868 and 1940. A single winter in a single watershed might produce 800,000 ties floated down a single river. The Encampment River Tie Drive of 1902 carried 350,000 ties past Saratoga in 9 days. The men who worked those drives lost a man a week in the big years, and the wood went where the rails went. Ties from the Medicine Bow rode east under the Union Pacific to Omaha, Chicago, and beyond. Ties from the Appalachians went south under the Southern Railway. Ties from the Ozarks went west under the Frisco. Ties from the piney woods of East Texas went up under the Santa Fe. The whole country was running on timber cut by men the country never learned to name, laid by section crews who replaced a rotten tie on a hot afternoon in Nebraska and never thought once about the Norwegian who had hewn it 16 winters earlier at 20 below zero above a creek in Wyoming, and the trees went too. The lodgepole stands of the Medicine Bow were clear-cut in blocks, replanted in some places, left to come back on their own in others. Second-growth lodgepole today stands on ground where a hack stood 140 years ago. The stumps he left are gone into the duff. The skidways are grown over. The bunkhouses are foundations. Only the wood he cut, a little of it, here and there, still runs as split rail fences in Wyoming pastures or lies weathering in the grass along a closed spur. Before I finish, one more ask. If any of this has gotten under your skin the way it got under mine, subscribe to the channel. That's the only way I can keep digging up these stories. Hit the button, stay with me. The tie hack camps kept running until about 1940. Diesel saws came in. Creosote plants came in. Hardwood ties pressure treated in Louisiana began to displace the hand-hewn lodgepole of Wyoming. By the Second World War, the broadaxe was retired. The last tie hack camp in the Medicine Bow at Dutton Creek closed in 1945. The bunkhouse stood another 30 years. A forest fire took it in 1976, and the ties themselves, most of them, are gone. A hand-hewn lodgepole tie lasted 7 to 12 years under traffic before it had to be pulled and replaced. The replacements were creosote-soaked oak. The original ties were burned for fuel or rotted in the right-of-way or split for kindling by section men. A few survive. You can find them sometimes in the brush along abandoned Union Pacific spurs. Squared on two sides, chalk marked for inspection with a pencil a hack used in 1892. Still smelling faintly of pine pitch a century and a quarter later. I have one on my porch. I pulled it out of a fence line in Carbon County 6 years ago with the permission of the rancher whose fence it was part of. The rancher's grandfather had been a tie hack. The tie was cut, the rancher thought, about 1894. The axe marks on it are still clean enough to read. You can see where the hack stood. You can see where the broad axe rose and fell. You can see the one place on the edge where the hack hit a knot wrong and split a chip deeper than he meant to. And you can tell from the next cut that he muttered something and kept going. I run my hand along that tie sometimes in the evening. I don't know whose hands cut it. I know only that the hands belong to a man who came from somewhere cold, who sent money home to someone, who ate beans at a long table in silence in a lantern-lit bunkhouse, who read a Bible in a language that wasn't English, who swung a 9-pound axe from before dawn to after dark in temperatures that would kill you, and who, if he was lucky, lived to see another spring and another drive and another pay envelope, and who most likely died in those mountains, and who is not on a stamp, not in a book, not on the side of any locomotive, not in the curriculum of any school, whose name, if we know it at all, is a single surname in the margin of a payroll ledger. Olson, Lindquist, Berg, Johnson, tie hack, 600 million ties, an army of men, 40 years of medicine bow winters, and then the axes went quiet? I'm glad you stayed with me. Tell me in the comments if your grandfather, your great-uncle, your great-grandfather worked the tie camps anywhere in America. I read every one. I'll see you in the next one. congestion over